What you see is the gauge cluster from a 1939 Chevrolet truck. Chevrolet used this arrangement from the mid-30s through 1939. One housing holds the fuel gauge and water temp, and the other holds the amp gauge and the oil pressure gauge. The fuel and amp gauge can be interchanged as well as the oil pressure and heat gauge. What we will be discussing today is the fuel gauge. When we look at the back of the fuel gauge, we will see two mounting studs. The one on the left is a 1032, and this is the stud that the wire from the sending unit attaches to. The 832 on the right is the input power from the ignition switch. The large brass plate between the two studs is the grounding plate. It grounds the fuel gauge to the gauge housing. This is a cardboard cutout that represents the back of the housing unit. You will notice 4 holes near the top of the housing unit and a square hole at the bottom. The holes at the top are to mount the fuel gauge. You will notice that the holes are quite a bit larger than the studs. The reason for this is so that you can adjust the position of the fuel gauge and keep the studs from contacting the gauge housing. It is important that the studs stay insulated from the housing to prevent shorting. When bolting the fuel to the gauge on, you will need to use an insulated washer. You will notice that on the back of these gauge housings that cardboard was used as an insulator. I had another gauge which was mounted with a Bakelite washers. You will also notice that between the two fuel gauge studs that there is a round nub. This nub needs to be positioned in the center hole, and it also needs to be insulated from the housing. The top hole is only used if you have a fuel gauge with vertical studs. This is what a gauge with vertical studs looks like. If you have a gauge with vertical studs, then you should use the top hole and the center hole to mount the gauge. The gauge with vertical studs does not have the center nub. Not all housings have the top hole. You will notice that neither of these two housings have the top hole, but they both have 3 horizontal holes. When testing the fuel gauge, you will need an ohm meter set to the 200 ohm setting. The resistance from the 1032 stud to ground should read somewhere between 25 and 33 ohms. The resistance between 832 stud and ground stud should be somewhere between 57 and 63 ohms. The resistance between the two studs should be somewhere around 30 to 33 ohms. Now this is a fuel sending unit much like the one in Chevrolets. It is not a Chevrolet sending unit but looks similar and works the same. When testing the sending unit, the resistance between the fuel gauge connector bolt and the ground should be 0 ohms when the float is in empty position down, and 30 ohms when the float is in the full position up. When there is no power to the fuel gauge, the needle will rest all the way to the left against the manual stop. If you have fuel in your tank and the gauge jumps to the empty mark, no matter how much fuel you have in the tank, then your problem is most likely that the grounding plate on the fuel gauge is not making good contact with the housing, or the housing is not making good contact with the chassis. You might try lightly sanding inside of the gauge housing and the brass plate between the two studs. Thanks for watching and good luck with your project.